I'm Joyce Connolly. I am co-owner and marketing director of Marshall Grain Company here in Grapevine, and October is the time for the fall monarch butterfly migration. Each year, millions of monarch butterflies make a 3,000-mile trek from the Northern U.S. and Southern Canada back to their breeding grounds and overwintering grounds in the Oyamel Forest in central Mexico. In order to get there, they will pass through what's called the Texas funnel along the way. And in fact, nearly 40% of all monarchs in North America pass through Texas gardens during their lifespan. With the total monarch population in steep decline, though, Texas gardeners have a chance to make a huge difference in the long-term health and well-being of our nation's endangered pollinators. In this video, I'm going to tell you what you need to create a monarch garden, including what plants you should offer to sustain them on their remarkable journey. And I'll also tell you about their life cycle, where they go when they migrate, and how they get there. So let's get started. As my first slide shows here on my screen share, this photo was taken right outside of our greenhouse here in Grapevine, and it's actually only a few feet wide and a few feet long. And we were able to fit a great selection of monarch plants in that small space. So even if you just have a small patio or a balcony, you can still plant some monarch plants in your in those spaces and help contribute to their plant life. So first of all, monarch butterflies that live east of the Rocky Mountains used to number in the hundreds of millions, but their population has declined dramatically just within the last 20 years by approximately 80%. Most of that is due to two things. One is habitat loss, and the other problem is the use of herbicides and pesticides in our gardens and in our agricultural use. So several conservation groups are working together with farmers and ranchers and park people and gardeners and all sorts of other people to develop and preserve habitat for the monarch's survival. So as a gardener, you can contribute to that habitat restoration through programs like the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge and some of the other citizen science programs that I'm going to mention at the end of this talk. But none of this makes any difference if you spray your plants with pesticides and herbicides. Butterflies are extremely sensitive to these, and even some organic insecticides are harmful to them. So even if the product doesn't kill them outright, it can cause them to have birth defects in their young. So it's critical, if you want to help the monarchs, that you become an organic gardener and that you stop using any kind of chemical or synthetic herbicides or pesticides. Some of the other benefits of being an organic gardener are that it's going to save you money, because over time, you're not going to use as much fertilizer and other products on your lawn and garden. So you're going to save money that way. You're also going to have your soil is going to be better at absorbing and retaining moisture, so you won't use as much water, which will also save you money. And you won't be putting toxins out, which is safer for your family and your pets. And you'll be working with nature instead of against it. So it won't be as much effort for you to have a garden. So let's move on and talk specifically about monarchs. First of all, we need to talk about how they come to be and how they breed. And as you can see from this slide here, the male on the right-hand picture has two small dots on the hind wings that identify it as a male, and the female doesn't have those dots. The way that they find each other, however, is through pheromones. They don't look to see who's got dots and who doesn't. They sniff each other out using pheromones. So when they breed, the female then goes in search of butterfly weed or milkweed, when she finds it, she will lay a single egg on that milkweed plant. If you find more than one egg on a milkweed plant, that means that more than one monarch has been on that plant. So then that egg hatches out into caterpillar, and that caterpillar goes through 4 very distinct stages called instars before it's ready to pupate. Pupate just means it's going to go through its transformation, going from becoming a caterpillar to becoming a butterfly, which is a pretty amazing process all by itself. When it's ready, the caterpillar will create what's called a chrysalis. It will attach itself to the underside of a leaf, usually on the milkweed plant, and build a chrysalis around itself. Some people use the word chrysalis and cocoon interchangeably, but to be correct, moths build cocoons and butterflies build chrysalises. So this dark green one is what the chrysalis looks like at the beginning of the transformation stage, whereas the one on the right, the black one, is when the monarch is almost ready to hatch. The whole process from laying an egg to becoming a butterfly is about 30 days, and so they spend about 8 to 15 days in the chrysalis stage. Unlike summer generations of monarchs, they live for about 2 to 6 weeks as adults as they're traveling north on their migration path. And the later generation, the one that comes back south, lives a lot longer. That one will live for about 9 months, and we'll get a little bit more into that further into this presentation. Monarchs have to have milkweed in order to breed. They also have to have nectar plants for the adults to eat. The monarch will only lay its eggs on a milkweed plant, which is an example of one is on the left-hand picture. There are a lot of different types of milkweed plants. They also need to have nectar plants for the adults. Adult butterflies of all types live by drinking flower nectar. And one thing that's curious about monarchs is that monarchs do not drink the nectar of the milkweed plant, probably to help ensure that more of the plant's energy goes into helping the egg to hatch and the caterpillar to make its transformation. So our milkweed plants depend on other pollinators like our native mason bees and native wasps to pollinate the milkweed plants so that the monarchs will have a place to lay their eggs and raise their young. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the interconnectedness of our environment and how important these plants are to all of our native pollinators. So back to the Asclepias family. Asclepias is the general name for the milkweed plant. And there are over 100 different types of milkweeds species that are native to North America, many of which are used by the monarchs. But only some of these do well in Texas. So we're going to focus on the ones that do well here in our local area. One thing I want to mention is that, unfortunately, most of our growers here in Texas grow the wrong kind of milkweed for North Texas. It's called a tropical milkweed, and it's this red and yellow flower that is what you'll usually find in nurseries. And it's more cold sensitive. It's native more to South Texas, so it's more cold sensitive. It doesn't overwinter here, as well as some of the other milkweed varieties that I'm going to be telling you about. And while this isn't all bad, because it's the only kind of milkweed that you can find, we're running the risk of just having a lack of plant diversity. And that can be dangerous because the monarch's diet will be limited to that one particular type of milkweed. And if for some reason anything were to happen to our milkweed supply, then the monarchs would have nothing else to fall back on. So we have been working very closely with our growers to get them to grow more of the specific types of milkweed that are better suited to North Texas. And we are also going to be growing some of our own milkweed in order to have increase the local supply of the more suitable milkweed varieties. So what are those varieties? Butterfly, I'm going to talk about several here. This is not all inclusive, but these are the major ones. One great kind of milkweed plant is called the butterfly weed, is the common name for it, Asclepias tuberosa. All of these Asclepias varieties that I'm going to be talking about are perennial, which means that they will come back every year. The orange one has obviously bright orange flowers, and it blooms from, generally speaking, from May to September. And it likes to be out in the middle of the prairie. It likes to be out in the sun. It doesn't grow very tall, so it wants to be around other low growing plants or off by itself where it can get lots of sunlight. It's drought tolerant, doesn't need a lot of water, and likes that hot, dry environment and our native soil. Another one that's quite different is the swamp milkweed, the Asclepias incarnata, also known as pink milkweed. This is another perennial that has rose or purple colored flowers. Looks a little bit different. And this one blooms from June to October. And unlike the butterfly weed, it does not like to be out in the sun. It prefers shade and moist soil, and gets a little bit taller than the butterfly weed. But the swamp milkweed is going to grow in areas where the soil is wet most of the time, not soaking wet, but moist at least. So you'll see this growing wild around the edges of Lake Grapevine and around ponds and things like that, where it can get more moisture and a little bit of shade and not quite so much sun. As I mentioned, diversity is really important. So it helps that these two grow in different environments. And then the same is true with our next pairing, the showy milkweed, Asclepias speciosa, is one that doesn't start blooming until May. It can get to be 6 feet tall. So it's much taller than the others, which is why it's called showy milkweed. It has more of blue-green leaves and sort of rose-colored flowers, whereas the antelope horns milkweed on the right starts to bloom much earlier than the other ones. It starts blooming in March, and just as the monarchs are emerging out of their hibernation and beginning their northward migration journey. And it will continue to bloom until October. So there again, there are some differences in habitat and so forth between these different varieties of milkweed that make it good that they have the diversity in the different types. Two more kinds of milkweed that are common to this area are the green milkweed, Asclepias viridis, and the whorled milkweed, the Asclepias verticillata. So there's quite a bit of variation here between the different types. And those are the most common ones. These are the ones that we're trying to get our growers to grow. And they're also some of the ones that we're going to be trying to grow ourselves here over this winter and hopefully have available for you in the spring. All of these are intended to plant in the spring. They come out in the spring. That's when the plants are available to plant. If you're growing them from seed, you want to plant the seed now in the fall. So that they can germinate over the winter and then come out in the spring when the monarchs are coming out of hibernation. Many other insects also rely on these plants, reptiles, praying mantises. We need all of those creatures to keep the monarchs healthy. Nectar plants are another important feature that you need to have in your butterfly garden. Nectar plants, there are hundreds of different nectar plants that you could plant in your garden. Just about any Texas native perennial would be good for monarch. Native plants are preferable to exotic plants. For example, some of the hybrid hydrangeas and so forth are very pretty, and the insects will go to them, but they found that non-native plants do not sustain the insect population or the bird population as well as native plants do. So it's preferable to have the native plants rather than trying to grow exotic plants in your garden. It's also important to have plants that bloom at different times during the year. The monarchs need to have nectar plants available basically from March, the beginning of March, through the middle of November to make sure that they have something blooming throughout that entire time to keep them alive. And very few plants will bloom continuously over that entire period. So you need to offer a variety of things that bloom at different times. And a few good plants, there is a handout available on with a list of plants that are good for a butterfly garden. But just to mention a few, for example, in this picture, we have aster, which blooms in the fall, coneflower, which blooms in the spring as well as the fall, butterfly bush, which is a much larger shrub type plant that comes in several different colors. And that one blooms primarily in the late spring and summer. And then you can also plant a lot of annual plants like alyssum, dianthus, snapdragons, marigolds, petunias, almost anything that flowers is going to attract some sort of pollinator. One of the most awesome things about living in Texas is that we are on the what they call the Texas funnel. Texas is ground zero basically for the monarch migration and for the migration of a lot of other insects and birds and other migratory species. It's also called the Central Flyway. The monarch is the only butterfly known to make a complete two-way migration from north to south. But what's crazy about it is that it's not the same butterfly making the journey. There are like 4 stages. There's a second group that goes through the West Coast. That is called the Western group. They live west of the Rocky Mountains. We live east of the Rocky Mountains. And our group travels the furthest and is the largest of the two, is much, much larger than the West Coast group. But what happens is the monarchs start in the Oyamel Forest in Mexico. After they've been overwintering there, they come out in the spring and mate. And as soon as they've done that, they die. And their first generation of babies travels north into back up into Texas and so forth, and starts to spread out across the plains. And they travel about 1/3 of the journey. The entire journey is about 3,000 miles from the Oyamel Forest all the way to southern Canada. And so each group of monarchs travels about 1/3 of that, so about 1,000 miles from the Oyamel Forest north into Texas and the lower southeast. And then that generation has their babies, and that generation dies. And generation 2 travels further up into the central plains, like Iowa and Kansas and so forth. And then finally, a 3rd generation makes their way up into the most northern parts of the United States and southern Canada. But as soon as they arrive in Texas, they're, all along the way, all along this journey, they're looking for milkweed to continuously lay their eggs, and looking for nectar plants to eat to keep themselves alive. And then generation 4 stays in that region in Northern U.S. and Southern Canada for part of the summer, foraging and so forth. And then along about August, they enter a phase called reproductive diapause. And that means that the last generation, that 4th generation of monarchs, basically they stop reproducing, they stop mating, and they start to orient themselves in a southerly direction. So they start flying south. Somehow they know which way is south, and they all turn themselves at more or less the same time in a southerly direction and start flying back toward Texas, back toward our Texas funnel. And that group of monarchs travels the entire 3,000 miles from northern Canada or southern Canada all the way back to the Oyamel Forest, whereas the northbound ones only travel part of that distance. So they use the same route every single year. Somehow, even though these monarchs have never been on this journey before, somehow know where they're going and know what path to follow. I think that's truly amazing. Another truly amazing fact is that about 40% of the total monarch population of North America passes through Texas on some part of their journey. So either northbound or southbound, they are passing through that Texas funnel. And that represents a huge percentage of the total monarch population in the United States. So we play a very unique and important role in preserving the monarch population. I'm gonna skip to the next slide here and talk about when to expect monarchs. And every year, citizen scientists and monarch butterfly enthusiasts excitedly track the migration by tracking monarch sightings within each of the bands shown on this map of the U.S. They can start to estimate the number of butterflies that are migrating, and also when those butterflies are going to arrive in the next band on the map. And generally speaking, they're going to reach North Texas in October. The exact date and the exact day of when that number peaks is going to vary from year to year, depending on weather across the country. And if it's especially cold in the north, they may start migrating sooner. If it's especially warm, they may stay up there a little bit longer. But generally speaking, they're going to start traveling south and reach Texas around the beginning of October, and their number is going to peak around mid-October. So this is the perfect time to be out there looking for monarchs and getting excited about the migration. How do they find their way? How do they do this? This is such an amazing thing. The most incredible thing about them is the fact that it's not the same monarch making this journey, that the southbound monarchs are a completely different generation, several generations removed from the one that began the northward journey. So how do they know when it's time? For one thing, their diapause that they go through is an indicator for them. The change in day length, they believe, is also a signal. The days grow shorter as we get into October, and temperatures cool down. All of those are clues to them that it's time to start migrating. As they're traveling, they will do things like use air currents and thermals to help make it a little bit easier for them to cover so much territory. But the other possible thing, scientists aren't even entirely sure how they find their way, but they believe that monarchs probably also have an internal magnetic compass built into their bodies. They have a solar receptor or multiple solar receptors in their antennae that provide both a timing cue and a directional cue as to which way to go and when to go. They also think that UV light plays an important role in their ability to sense what time of year it is and which way to go. Another hypothesis is that they may use what's called a sun compass. Monarchs can only fly during the day. At night, they congregate together in trees to sleep. So one possibility is this sun compass, which measures the angle of the sun on against the horizon and could point the way to their overwintering sites. In this scenario, monarchs use the angle of the sun on the horizon in combination with an internal body clock to maintain a southwesterly flight path. The trick, though, is that they could not use this method alone, because if they did, all of them would fly just in a general southerly direction, and they wouldn't all end up in the same place. They would be scattered across Mexico rather than focusing in on the Oyamel Forest. So another idea is that monarchs use the geography of the continent to help find their way. As I mentioned, the Texas funnel. The reason it's called the Texas funnel, or what makes it a funnel, is the Rocky Mountains are on one side and the Gulf of Mexico would be on their other side. And they don't want to fly over the mountains and they don't want to fly over the water. So that geography would naturally channel them toward the center of Texas and down that central flyway. So anyway, then once they get past our Texas funnel, they're pretty much all honed in on that Oyamel Forest, and they are going to overwinter there and make their roosts on the south and southwesterly facing slopes of the mountains. And they congregate together to stay warm, help keep each other warm and so forth. And then they go into hibernation until the following spring, and the whole process starts over again. So that is a pretty amazing journey. But here's a few more facts about the monarch migration before we close here. Monarchs, as I mentioned, can only travel during daylight hours. They have to roost at night and rest. And each monarch travels about 100 or more miles per day. They've tagged some monarchs and found that they have traveled over 200 miles, but on average, they think monarchs travel about 100 miles a day. And then at night, they congregate in trees to roost for the night. And another interesting thing, amazingly, is that they are able to find the same roosting places year after year after year, even though these monarchs have never been there before. But they will cluster together on a single tree in order to keep each other warm and to conserve energy during the night. And then in the morning, they'll fly off again until they get to the end of their journey. So that is the complete migration cycle. And if you're interested in learning more about monarchs or just having fun with monarchs, there are a number of great ways that you can do that. One way is to build a pollinator garden and then register that garden with millionpollinatorgardens.org. You don't have to do anything special other than have a pollinator garden. All you have to do is go onto their website and put in your address, and they will add your address to a map that shows well over 1 million gardens that are all registered as pollinator gardens along the Central Flyway. So you can be a part of that huge project that involves millions of other people. And another way that you can participate is to get a sign for your garden like we have. Again, all you need to do is have a pollinator garden and then go to their website and register your site. And then you can buy a sign that shows that your garden is a monarch way station. And another way that you can help is to go to journeynorth.org and actually help track the migration and get more involved and actually be outside and looking for monarchs, recordings, the sightings that you make, and even tagging monarchs so that when another person finds that monarch, they know that somebody else is already tracking that monarch, and so they can track the individual monarchs as they make their way along the path and see exactly where they're going and how long it takes them to get there and so forth. So those are 3 great ways that you can become involved. In summary, I just want to remind you that it's extremely important that you practice organic methods and refrain from using any kind of chemical or synthetic pesticides. You have to have milkweed in order for them to breed, and you have to have nectar plants and other habitat like water sources, and get out there and have fun. It's great to be outside in this beautiful fall weather and chase monarchs around and have a good time and learn something while you're at it. So I appreciate your time today and hope you will come and see us all at Marshall Grain. So thank you again for your time. And this will conclude our presentation.